Larry, can you hear us? You ready? Okay, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our evening meeting for our new board members. My name is Tony Burden. I'm the chair of the board. I welcome everybody. Angela is going to probably run this meeting for us tonight and make sure that we get everything taken care of. I do know that one of the reasons why we're on this call as a Zoom call tonight is due to the safety of the Stay-at-Home Act on order by the governor. And so we're trying our best to do, and as you can see, I apologize again, walking in the house, my phones are ringing also, but we'll get that taken care of. But again, we're on the Zoom call tonight because of the fact that we're trying our best to practice social distancing and take into consideration everything that needs to be done. So I'm going to turn the meeting over to Angela so that we can get started with our training, while I also work on muting out some of these other things.
Okay, I'll have Candace do the roll call, please.
Tony Burton.
Present.
Pam Corbett.
Here.
Michael Ricker. Twana Roebuck.
Present.
Brittany Spees.
Present.
Theotis Chun. Michael Fraden.
Present.
Beverly Carter Levy. Kathy McLean. Leon McCullough. Emer Masacampo. That's it.
Okay, thank you. If you all would pull up your membership list, I thought maybe I would start out with that because I think that's helpful in terms of discussing the structure of the CPRB. If you have that list handy, the first thing I think you'll probably notice is that there are 11 CPRB members. You have a chair and a vice chair. 2 officers, and the officers serve basically one-year terms. Each officer can serve up to 6 one-year terms. And as you know by now from our last meeting, officers are basically nominated by the nominating committee, which is selected in October, and they present their report to the CPRB in the following January. So the nominating committee will be working on that pretty soon. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. The other thing, if you look at the membership list, you'll notice that everybody appears to live in the city of Winston-Salem. I hope that's the case because the ordinance requires the member to be a city resident. So if for some reason you decide to move out of the city limits, please let me know, because then the mayor will have to find a replacement and recommend that replacement to the city council for appointment. So again, you have to be a city resident to be a member of the CPRB. One of the other things in the far right-hand column you'll notice is that we've put the date you were appointed as well as the expiration date. And the reason that is important to keep up with, as I mentioned at the last meeting, the term of office is 3 years. However, as we all know, as things happen sometimes, appointments are not made necessarily on time. They may be delayed for whatever reason. And so while the term itself is 3 years, under the city code, a member can actually be served 2 terms, 2 consecutive terms. So while the term is 3 years, if your appointment is delayed for some reason, it matters, because if it's delayed for too long, the time that you actually serve in that first term may not count as a full term. So while you're limited to 2 consecutive terms, if you did not serve 50% or more of the first term, then that term doesn't count. So in theory, you could be appointed 2 more times. So for that reason, you may find that some members may have actually served 7 years, and that's because their first term didn't actually count. So what I decided to do to kind of keep things in order, if you look at Pamela Corbett, you'll see that she was appointed in March of 2017. Her term expired in April of 2020, and she was reappointed September of this year, and her term will expire in April of 2023. And because that first term, in essence, was more than 50%, and the second term would be more than 50%, this will actually be her last term. So that, under the rules, she will have served 2 consecutive terms. And when you serve 2 consecutive terms, you have to basically sit out or have a lapse in service if you want to come back to the same board of 3 years, basically the length of the term. So if she's interested in coming back after April of 2023, she would have to sit out 3 years, and then she could reapply for the same board. Now, if she were interested in another board, like the Zoning Board of Adjustment, she would only need to sit out a year, and then she could be considered for the Zoning Board of Adjustment in basically 2024. The only exception to that is when the city has difficulty finding citizens who are available to serve on certain boards and commissions, and then they can make an exception to that 1 year lapse or the lapse of the term of the office. And that has happened on occasion because sometimes it's difficult finding citizens to serve because they have other commitments and so forth, which is the reason why, in part, this appointment the last time was delayed for a considerable length of time. And I've tried to, by each person's name, to indicate what term they're in and whether or not they're eligible for reappointment. Are there any questions with respect to the membership list? Okay. Let's see. Okay. The next thing I thought I might turn your attention to is pull up the rules and regulations, and then also the city ordinance. The rules and regulations, of course, say rules and regulations at the top. And then you have the city ordinance, which created the CPRB, says Division 3, Citizen Police Review Board at the top, and then you have a PowerPoint presentation. And what I thought I would do, instead of going through everything, is just hit the highlights. One of the first things I think I need to mention is that the rules and regulations will need to be updated next year. There have been a couple of changes to the overall city code. If you look at the rules and regulations, you'll see throughout the document several references to the city secretary's office, and that office is now called the city clerk's office. So that will need to be changed in your rules and regulations. And you also notice on page 3, there's a reference to the Human Relations Department where a citizen can file a complaint. At the time the rules and regulations were first adopted, the Human Relations Department was, I think, on Patterson Avenue. And so the city wanted to make sure citizens had an opportunity to find a place in the community to file a complaint. The Human Relations Department has since moved, is actually in City Hall now. And so the code was amended to take out the reference to filing a complaint in the Human Relations Department. So basically now, and I'll go over this in greater detail, you can file a complaint at the city secretary's office or city clerk's office now, or the Internal Affairs, which is now Professional Standards Division. So there have been a few changes. I guess the other change would be that my office or my staff serves as secretary, administrative support to the CPRB rather than the city secretary's office. So there are a few changes, and I'll make sure we prepare those for you to adopt, if not in January, at your April meeting. So that's the rules and regulations. Thought I might talk a little bit about the CPRB, how it got started, why it was started, and then the process. If you had a chance to look at the PowerPoint, you'll know that the CPRB was created in 1993. And at that particular point in time, there were a number of things happening in the community, a number of concerns expressed by citizens in terms of their interactions with the police department. There was also at the time a police chase through one of our communities that caused some concern. And as a result of dialogue between the community and the city council decided to create the CPRB in 1993, and has basically operated since that point in time. The purpose of the Citizen Police Review Board is to serve as an advisory board to the Public Safety Committee, and the board itself reviews appeals of complaints that have been filed by the citizens. The complaint is filed, as I mentioned before, in the city secretary's office, city clerk's office rather, or in professional standards. Citizen can file the complaint in one of two places, as I indicated. And once that complaint is filed, it's investigated by the Professional Standards Division. Normally, the Professional Standards Division will talk with the complainant and all of the officers or employees involved in the complaint, prepare an investigative report, an investigative package for the chief to review, and the chief will render a decision and notify the complaining party of that decision. And in that decision, or in that letter that notifies the complaining party of the decision, the chief will advise the complaining party that he or she has the right to file an appeal before the CPRB. And that appeal is filed in the city clerk's office. And once that appeal is filed, that's when you all really come into play. And that's the purpose of your meeting on November 12th. And basically, once the appeal is filed, the CPRB generally will review that appeal within 30 days. And as I've indicated before, because it is a complaint against a police department employee, it is considered confidential. And so your review of that appeal will be in closed session. And so that's the purpose of having the meeting on the 12th. You'll start out in open session, do the roll call and so forth, and then you'll go into closed session to review the appeal. And we always talk about appeals, not by the person's name, but by the number. And the number, of course, for next week is number 103. And once you have the motion to go into closed session and that passes, one of the first things I will try to do at the beginning before you actually start to discuss the case is to find out whether or not anyone has a conflict. And what I mean by that is whether or not any of the board members have any reason to believe that they cannot be impartial in reviewing the appeal. An example of that would be, say, for instance, if you're were good friends with either the complaining party or the employee that's involved, and you feel like you can't be impartial because of that friendship, then I would think that would be a reason to ask to be excused from reviewing that particular appeal. And you generally get the package ahead of time, so you should be able to know ahead of time, at least when you come to the meeting, whether or not there's a potential conflict. And that's when we'll discuss in closed session whether or not you need to be excused from that conflict. If you know for sure and really don't want to come to the meeting because you feel like there's no need in coming due to that conflict, I mean, we can certainly discuss that ahead of time. Generally, I'd like for the board to excuse a member from participating because of the conflict, but at the same time, if it's inconvenient, you just rather not come and just say, I feel like I need to be excused because of the conflict, I can certainly report that to the board as well. But generally, that's when we handle potential conflicts at the beginning before we actually delve into discussing the case. Is there any questions about that? Okay. And so once we basically take care of any potential conflicts, then of course, that's when the board starts to discuss the case. As you know, from the package that's been sent out, we try to provide the materials ahead of time because quite often the packages are pretty thick and you need that time to review the case file before you come to the meeting, because the purpose of the meeting is really to kind of engage each other in a discussion about the case at the meeting, not necessarily in the meeting, but if you need the Professional Standards Division personnel to help prepare the investigation and the summary, if you need them to be present, of course, they will be invited into the meeting to answer any questions you might have. But generally, the purpose of the meeting is for you all to review the case file. But again, if you need staff there that help prepare the investigative report, to answer questions, they can be called into the meeting to answer those questions. One of the things I think in terms of reviewing the appeal that needs to be made clear, and we're certainly trying to make it clear to the complaining party, is that the CPRB during this appeal process is simply reviewing the record to determine whether or not the case warrants a full-blown hearing. So the individual complaining party, just like the officers, they're informed of the meeting, but they are not necessarily present for the meeting. So while you all in closed session, if the complaining party is there in another room, they will stay there unless, and that includes the officers as well, they will stay there unless there is a question that the board has and the board agrees that the individual needs to come in and answer the question mainly for clarification purposes. Otherwise, the officer, the employee, the complaining party, everybody stays outside the room while the CPRB is actually reviewing the case. Again, if there are questions that need to be asked, the board members agree that the questions should be asked of either the complaining party or the officers or an employee, then they can be called into the meeting for the purpose of answering those questions. And then when you all are finished, they will be excused from the meeting. Because again, this is you all's time to review the complaint, the appeal, whatever evidence has been presented, the summary investigative report. And it's at that review stage, you all look at everything and determine whether or not the case warrants a full-blown hearing. If you all decide that it doesn't, well, regardless of what you all decide, once you in the closed session, the chair will announce whether or not in the case of, in this case, appeal number 103, the CPRB has decided to hold a hearing. If the decision is to hold a hearing, then the chair will also announce at that point in time, without giving names or anything, just by number, that in the case of appeal number 103, the board has decided to hold a hearing. The hearing will be at such and such time on such and such date and place and so forth. So that information will be announced at the once you come out of closed session. That information will be announced, and we'll also send a letter to both the complaining party and the employees against whom the complaint was filed, notifying them of the decision. Of course, if the decision is to not hold a hearing, it ends there. If the decision is in fact to hold a hearing, then, as I said before, you have to schedule the hearing, and the complaining party, the officers involved, everything will be held in closed session, just like the review was held in closed session. The hearing will be held in closed session. Both sides have the opportunity to be represented by an attorney or someone else of their choice. And it's almost like having an informal kind of trial. The complaining party generally will go first, present his or her complaint and evidence. The officers or employees, attorney, or if they're not represented, the employee has the right to cross-examine the complaining party and vice versa. And you all as board members have an opportunity to ask questions of both parties as well. Again, you're trying to get to the facts, trying to determine whether or not there were code of conduct, rule of conduct violations. And by the way, at the point that you all review the package, you'll have as part of the summary what potential rule of conduct was violated and whether, I mean, that's part of the package. If you looked at what you have so far, they'll identify the rule of conduct that came into play or that was potentially violated. And when you do the hearing, the actual rule of conduct, whatever that might be, will be available for you to actually look at it as well as you conduct the hearing and ask questions if you need to. Essentially, it's like, as I said before, it's like a mini trial. And once I guess the hearing is closed, you have an opening, generally an opening presentation of evidence by both parties. They'll do a closing argument generally, and then the hearing will basically at that point conclude. After that, the board has basically about 20 days to put together its findings of fact. And once you put that together as a board, you all have to vote on those findings of fact, and they basically are approved by a majority vote. Those findings of fact will go to the city manager as well as the public safety committee. Because it is a personnel matter, the city manager basically makes the final decision as to what should happen to that employee based upon what you all managed to find as part of your findings of fact. And sometimes the board has in the past, in addition to making its findings of fact, come up with, has presented recommendations as well. In one case in particular, there was a recommendation as related to pepper spray and the use of pepper spray that was part of the package that the board presented to the city manager. But in the end, as I indicated, the city manager basically makes the final decision. But your findings of fact and recommendations are basically presented to the city manager and the public safety committee. And of course, under confidential cover, because again, it's considered a personnel matter. There's a lot. Any questions about that? Okay. Let's see. So that's the one other thing I'd like to mention too is that the CPRB does not have subpoena power. So basically, you're relying upon the complaining party and other folks to appear before you voluntarily. The city sought to obtain legislation from the General Assembly authorizing the board to have subpoena power. I think they tried in 1993, 1995. And it's come up a couple of times since then, but the General Assembly has not had much of an appetite for giving citizen police review boards, not just ours, any of them. There are a few others across the state, but the General Assembly has not had much appetite for giving subpoena power to the citizen police review boards across the state. So because of such, you have to depend upon folks voluntarily coming before the board. And generally you don't have, especially if the board decides that it wants to conduct a hearing, generally you will not have a problem with the complaining party coming forward. And for the most part, we've not had a problem with the employees that have been the subject of the complaint coming forward. It may generally be the witness for one or the other that's reluctant to come forward and may not participate. But assuming they provided testimony or an interview to the Professional Standards Division, you at least have that interview summary and information. One of the other things I think is important to note is that quite often, well, most of our officers have body-worn cameras, and because of the change in the law a couple of years ago relating to the footage of body-worn cameras, we are not at liberty, unfortunately, to share that video footage with the Citizen Police Review Board. When we first started out, and I think body-worn cameras were in use by our police officers, we had the flexibility at that time to provide that footage to the Citizen Police Review Board if it decided it needed it. But like I said, a few years ago, the General Assembly decided to make body-worn camera, the footage from those cameras, to exclude those from the public records law. So they're no longer available without a court order. And that includes, we can't share it with our city council, we can't share it with the Citizen Police Review Board. If for some reason the board felt it was necessary to see the footage from that police officer's body-worn camera, what I could do conceivably is apply to the court for an order permitting you all to see that footage, but it would have to be in closed session. Unfortunately, as I said, with the change in the law, that's the only way we can do it at this point in time. So, let's see. Any questions about the CPRB process? Okay. Real quick, open meetings law. You should have a handout regarding that, and I'm not going to touch all 20 pages of that. I'm just going to point out a couple of things. Of course, as you all know, the Citizen Police Review Board is considered a public body, and a public body is a body of at least 2 members appointed by a local government. In this case, City Council appointed you all upon recommendation of the mayor. And as a public body, you all are subject to the open meetings law. And one of the things that I think is important to remember about the open meetings law is that it applies when you have an official meeting. An official meeting is, for example, when you're having a hearing, deliberating on anything, conducting public business. If you're just having a social gathering of a majority of the members, that's not considered an official meeting. But at the moment you all decide you're out for dinner and you want to talk about potentially changing the structure of the CPRB or something related to the CPRB, that social gathering has now been converted to a public meeting. And arguably that setting now would be in violation of the open meetings law. When a majority of the members of the CPRB, in this case 6, are gathered together for the purpose of conducting business, then we have an obligation under the law to make sure that we notify the public in accordance with the open meetings law of that meeting, the date, time, place, location, everything. And then we also have to make sure that the public is allowed to have access to that meeting, attend that meeting. Of course, the exception would be when you all have to go in a closed session to consider something that's confidential. So generally, official meetings of the CPRB have to meet the open meetings law in terms of identifying ahead of time, meeting the notice requirements and everything like that. Let's see. One of the things I think is important to remember too is it's easy to think of a meeting when everybody's kind of gathered together in a room or like we're doing Zoom. But the other thing, if you all will notice or have noticed, when I send you all communications, I generally will send it to the chair and I will blind copy everybody else. And the reason I do that is because the concern about potentially having a meeting, an electronic meeting, in violation of open meetings law. So if there's an email that needs to be sent out and it's something that needs to be shared with all of the board members, what I tell folks to do is send it to either me or send it to the chair and then blind copy the other board members so that if anybody hits reply all, it'll simply go to the person who sent it and not everybody on the board. Because if you send it to everybody on the board, then arguably you've engaged in a meeting electronically without meeting the open meetings requirements in terms of notifying the public about the meeting and how to access it and so forth. And then that becomes a potential violation of the open meetings law. So again, if you have something and you need to share with the entire board, just send it to the chair and then blind copy everybody else. Or you can send it to me and let me do it. And then that takes care of it altogether. Generally, there are 4 types of meetings, but for the most part, the 2 I think that you all are probably most likely to have are the regular meetings. And of course, as we mentioned last month, your regular meetings are January, April, July, and October. The 3rd Thursday of the month at 6 o'clock. Those are your regular meetings. The meeting today and your meeting next week, of course, are special meetings. And you have special meetings basically to review appeals. Let's see. And you'll see the various requirements for special meetings and the type of notice you have to give and so forth. There was one member, just so you know, who asked me about next week's meeting and attending the meeting virtually. And as I mentioned to the member, the meeting has been advertised as an in-person meeting and not as a virtual meeting, and it's been set up as an in-person meeting. And so to try to change it at the last minute would require us to go back and send out additional notices saying that we've converted the meeting from an in-person meeting to a virtual meeting. And rather than try to do that, in addition to the fact that you all had voted when you have an appeal that you'd rather have that in person. I just told the member that we can't do it virtually, and it becomes a virtual meeting if one person participates virtually. So I told him he's not allowed to participate virtually. It has to be in person. Of course, he indicated he would not be able to make it. But it's for that reason, and plus the fact that the board had previously voted to have the review of appeals in person, that I said we need to stick with an in-person meeting. Now, at the meeting on the 12th, if you all decide going forward you want to have those type of review meetings in virtually, then you all can do that going forward. But of course, the one on the 12th will be an in-person meeting. And so I'll take this moment to remind you, it's at the Benton Convention Center. Wear your mask. It's a huge room. Everybody would be spread out, but still bring your mask, wear your mask. And as I mentioned before, in terms of going over the process, we'll start out an open session, then you go into closed session and do your review. But again, it will be in person.
So, Attorney, is there a period in the summer that we don't meet? Like some bylaws indicate July, August, we don't have summer meetings. Is that the case for this body?
Well, since you only meet quarterly, again, January, April, July, and October, you just meet 4 times a year. So those are your regular meetings. Now, you have special meetings when you have to review an appeal. And generally what's happened, if one comes in, say, for instance, like the end of July, after you've had a meeting, but before your next regular meeting, you'll schedule a special meeting, and you try to do that within 30 days. But if there are extenuating circumstances, vacation or something like that, yeah, you can take more than 30 days and schedule that out. Does that make sense?
Yes.
But there's no standing position that you don't meet in the summer, because you really only have that one regular meeting. And then if there's an appeal, you can kind of work around folks' schedule to schedule that appeal for review. We talked about closed session when I mentioned the appeal. Again, it's going to be in closed session, and for the most part, there are very few reasons that a body can go into closed session. And because you're reviewing confidential personnel information, that's basically the basis for going into closed session. Let's see. And talks a little bit about failure to comply with the law and so forth. One of the things I do want to talk to you about a little bit is public records. Generally, what you know is not considered a public record, but the moment you reduce it to writing, that written document is considered a public record. Now, because you all are in a unique situation of reviewing confidential personnel information, that is not considered a public record. It's one of the exceptions to a public record. So generally what I've asked the board members to do in the past, once you all finish with those packages, you have appeal number 103 now. Once you finish with that package, we will take that up. That way you don't have to worry about the package falling into wrong hands or forgetting that it's confidential and leaving it somewhere and somebody else picking it up. So for instance, if at the end of the closed session for November 12th, you decide not to hold a hearing, I'll be happy to take the package from you at that point in time. Now, if you decide to hold a hearing, then you will hold on to that package until you complete the hearing process, your findings of fact, and you turn over your report to the city manager. And then at that point in time, I'll be happy to take it from you. Okay? Let's see. You'll see just at the end of that presentation, the whole list of other reasons or exceptions to the public records law. And again, you see the exception for personnel records and the exception for body-worn camera footage, which is due to that recent change in legislation. And we do, as you will see after your meeting on the 12th, we do prepare open session minutes, which will be very short, call to order, roll call, it'll identify who was present, then it's identify the motion to go into closed session. And then you have closed session minutes. Those minutes, because again, the basis for the closed session is to preserve the confidential information, those closed session minutes will not be released to the public. So you have, in theory, closed session minutes that will stay confidential, and then you have open session minutes that will be available to the public. So. Any questions about that? Questions? No? Okay. The last section I'm gonna cover is ethics. You should have a PowerPoint presentation on that, as well as the city's ethics policy. And again, I'm not going to go through the entire presentation. I'm going to kind of hit the highlights. The policy itself applies to city representatives, and members of boards and commissions are considered city representatives. So it applies to you all as members of the CPRB. Generally, it prohibits gifts, which include gift cards, entertainment, tickets, money, just about anything that you can think of. It prohibits the receipt of gifts. There are some exceptions. There's a whole list of them if you want to look at them in the policy on page, should be on the second page. Generally, those exceptions are a plaque in recognition of public service, a receipt of honorariums for participating in meetings, attendance at a banquet or a professional association event, souvenirs of nominal value, and the city has basically decided nominal value is about $25. Meals or non-discounted, solicited rather, discounted meals not to exceed $25 per meal, as long as there's no anticipation of future business as a result of that meal. And publicly acknowledge and approve discounts for all city employees, or for all employees. One of the things I think, even if, for example, it is covered, the gift is covered by an exception, if someone is still trying to give you, for example, a meal card, I don't know, the $25 meal card is going to influence you too much, but in theory, if they're trying to give you a $25 meal card to influence a decision that you have to make as a member of the Citizen Police Review Board, then you have to, reject or decline that gift card, because again, it's given with the intention of influencing a decision that you have to make. I think one of the things in terms of you all's role that perhaps is most important in the policy is making sure, I guess relates more to conflicts of interest, not necessarily that you're trying to use any information that you get as a member of the board for your personal gain, but trying to make sure, again, as we mentioned earlier, that in serving your role as a member of the Citizen Police Review Board, that you try to avoid any conflicts in reviewing a case or in hearing a case. I doubt that you would necessarily get any, quote, inside information that you could use for personal gain. So for you all, it would be basically trying to make sure that you are compliant with your obligation to keep confidential the information that you have, your obligation to avoid conflicts as you review and hear appeals. Let's see. The other thing, I know this is probably for, let's see, Ms. Roebuck. in particular. The other thing that the ethics policy deals with is contracts with the city. And if you have a contract with the city, or you plan on having a contract in the future with the city, let me know, because I have to look at that contract or that potential serve as a contract with the city to determine whether or not there is a conflict or a violation of the ethics policy. Generally, in the case of, is it ESR?
Yes.
Okay. In the case of ESR, which is a nonprofit entity, and you are the executive director, is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
And I believe they receive some grant funding from the city?
Yes.
Okay. So when we looked at that, determined that that was not a conflict. I mean, as a CPRB member, you do not have an opportunity to administer or vote on whether or not your nonprofit entity gets that contract. So we just looked at the situation and determined that it was okay for you to serve on the CPRB. Now, it may be different if you were talking about serving on a committee that would oversee the administration of the grant, because you would be, your entity or your employer would be getting a grant. That might present an issue of a conflict. But because you're a member of the CPRB, and the CPRB has absolutely nothing to do with the grant process or application, then that's not a conflict. Now, if a different situation where you had a for-profit entity and the president of that for-profit entity was wanting a contract with the city, again, we would have to look at that, scrutinize that to see whether or not that would be permitted. So again, if there's any chance of your company, your employer, your business getting a contract with the city, please let me know so we can make sure there's no conflict, no violation of city policy or ethics policy. If you have one and I'm not aware of it, just let me know so I can take a look at that and make sure it doesn't violate the ethics policy. We try to encourage, the council tries to encourage citizens to participate on city boards and commissions. So we try to balance that potential of a conflict with the need for citizens to actually be involved in city government. So we don't like to necessarily discourage citizens from participating in city government, but we also want to make sure we don't have a conflict, or at least the appearance of a conflict. So we need to basically analyze that and make sure everything's okay. So again, if you have a contract that I haven't mentioned, or you're looking at getting one potentially in the future, just let me know so I can take a look at that and determine whether or not that's a problem. So that's kind of, I think, pretty much the highlights. You have your reference materials. If you need to take a look at that in the future, or if you have a specific question or concern, my contact information is on the back, and you all have my email, and just email me. So this, in a nutshell, and I know that was fairly quick, but I know folks have other things to do. We've covered the CPRB rules and regulations, the CPRB ordinance, the ethics policy, the open meetings and public records law. And I try to hit on those aspects of each that really relate to your role as members of the CPRB, as opposed to just everything in the kitchen, with the kitchen sink. So are there any questions? I know that's a lot, and I probably talked quite fast, but I'll be happy to answer questions. I can't hear you. Do you have any questions, Pam? Unmute yourself.
No, I just wanted to say you did a nice job, nice review. I appreciate it.
Oh, good. Good. Hopefully everybody has the same understanding. That's why I invited the current members. Since I've not been with you all in a while, I just felt like I needed to make sure everybody had that basic level of understanding, information going forward. And then next time, Miss Fred will be here with you, and she'll do the training session. I'm sure she'll do a much better job and probably not talk as fast. So.
Well, we appreciate you doing this for us. I know I appreciate it. I always need the refresher course Hopefully everyone can hear me okay.
Okay.
The next thing on our agenda is new business. And as you know, we've already stated that on November the 12th at 6 p.m. at the Benton Convention Center, we'll be hearing the appeal number 103. And so make sure you keep that on your calendar. If there's a conflict, if you can't make it, please let me know, or please let someone know at the city office so that we can make sure we have a quorum. I know it's important for us to have a quorum for that meeting. So please, if you cannot make that meeting, let us know in advance if we have to reschedule it because we don't have a quorum.
I will say that we do have 2 members who will not be able to make it. Mr. Is it Riker and Mr. McCullough? Is there anybody else that's aware of a conflict? Okay, good. So we should have a quorum unless something else happens. And if it does, we'll let you know.
Great, great. Our next regularly scheduled meeting is scheduled for January the 21st at 6 p.m. That meeting will be a virtual meeting also. And so we'll look forward to getting that on your schedule and make sure everyone has the information for that. That'll be the regular meeting. There is nothing else on the agenda unless there's something from the floor. Is there any questions that anyone have?
That's one question I have.
Go ahead.
Is if for some reason a quorum is not achieved for this next meeting, you have to reschedule it? Would it be worthwhile to consider rescheduling it as a virtual meeting at that point, especially if more people can attend virtually?
If we have that problem, I think that's certainly a fair question, and we can certainly poll all of the members to see if that is the preferred way of having that meeting in the event we have to reschedule.
Any other questions on that?
But I'm hoping that will not happen.
Yeah, I'm hoping so also. Hopefully we don't have to reschedule it.
I will mention that I did reach out to the nominating committee to try to get some dates. Hopefully you all saw my email, some dates or a date that we can get together via Zoom to talk about the nominating committee process and so forth. It shouldn't take long for the 3 members of the nominating committee.
And I suspect that those members know who they are.
Yeah, let's see. Michael, Swana, and who else? Brittany. Are you with us, Brittany? I thought she was. Okay. All right.
Is there anything else? Any other additional questions? If not, then I will.
It quick.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I said I tried to make it quick.
You did a great job. I appreciate it. My 3 and 4 year old also appreciates it because they're getting very active over here on this end. But if not, I'll entertain a motion for us to adjourn.
So moved.
And I don't think we're going to need a second or a vote on that, are we?
No.
Just want to make sure. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great and pleasant evening. Be safe. Wear your mask. COVID is still out here and it's still alive. So please continue to practice safe distancing and things of that nature. Hope everyone have a blessed evening. Good night.
We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.